answers. But this was one of the things. Now, I mean, again, every American history book you read will have her name in it. This is one of the more famous cases that occurred in Puritanism, and one of the things that was to give Puritanism a bad name. Not only was, well, there were 3 people we know of who were banished from the Massachusetts colony. Thomas Hooker, who founded Connecticut, Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island, and Anne Hutchinson, who went to Rhode Island, and then only to get banished from there. Now, folk, what I'm about to say, we're all adults, I hope. You can take or leave. I think it's a classic case of a woman having a crush on the preacher. You don't have to believe that if you don't want to, but John Cotton was, during the trial, she said some things that made me think about sex. I mean, and also her doctrine that anything you committed was not a sin if you remember the elect. Again, all this kind of points in that direction. Again, it's difficult to prove it, and you don't have to believe it, but nevertheless, I think that was part of what was going on. Now, back in England, a civil war occurred in which the Puritans were victorious. They chopped off King Charles as the first head. Again, that's detail that you don't need to worry about, because this is not European history, this is not English history, but it is important. During the Civil War that occurred, the Puritans took over. Oliver Cromwell took over. Oliver Cromwell then outlawed drinking, alcohol, outlawed card playing, outlawed puppet shows. And what the people would do, they'd have a person staying at the door watching out for a constable. In the meantime, the puppet show would be going on inside. When the person at the door would, "Constable," everybody would quickly hide their puppets under floorboards or under the sofas or whatever they had. Hide the puppets away in closets. Then when the constable got gone, get out the puppets and resume the puppet shows from where they left off. But anyway, the United States later on was to try to outlaw drinking alcohol also, with bad results. Hey, let me tell you, on a personal note, I don't touch this stuff, but I believe that this is a decision each of you and me should be allowed to make individually. And if you develop a problem with it, don't blame the state for allowing it. If you develop a problem with it, it's your fault. If I develop a problem with it, it'll be my fault. Now, I have long suspected that I'm what you call a dry alcoholic. I never touch this stuff, but I think that if I ever do, it'll get me. If anyone was a dry alcoholic, I mean, you inherit it from your father, generally. If anyone was a dry alcoholic, my father was. But now, I say that knowing, saying this, one of my brothers started drinking. He quickly developed a problem with it. Another one of my brother's children took it up, and 2 of his children developed this problem. One of them a really serious problem with it. My great uncle, my grandfather's brother, took it up, and he developed a problem with it. So this all leads me to believe, also, if you become addicted to sweets or become addicted to things like card games, computer games, you might want to leave alcohol alone. If any of you want to argue with this, go ahead. I mean, I won't argue, but I'll listen to you. All right, anyway, so much for that. Fewer ships came from England during this time. New settlers were greatly reduced during the Civil War. The colonists then had to turn to make a living from forest. They trapped furs and they got timber. Turned to sea trade. In other words, fishing. New England became a big fishing place. Still is. Furs, not as much anymore. A lot of the furs have been trapped and there are restrictions now on hunting. Women often had 8 to 9 children, so even without immigrants coming over, the population boomed. The children lacked the religious zeal of their parents. Now, folks, this is very typical. I've seen many a case in my lifetime where the parents might be practically religious fanatics and their children indifferent, or vice versa, where the parents might be indifferent and their children become very, almost fanatically religious. But in this case, the parents had been very strong religious, the children lacked the zeal. Here's something else that made the people of Massachusetts, that disgraced them. Quakers came over and they were persecuted. The Quakers were persecuted in England for a while. They came into Massachusetts. 5 Quakers were hung. One of the books we had in this school named all the 5 that were hung. This even upset the king. The king wrote a letter to the governor. The governor promised that, well, I didn't know about it. I didn't know about this. In those days, I mean, today, when a man gets a death sentence, it might be anywhere from 15 to 25 years before he's actually executed. But in those days, they could give a man a death sentence today and execute him within a week or two. It took 4 months for a ship to get across the Atlantic and 4 more months to get back. But anyway, the king wrote the governor of Massachusetts a letter, and the governor said, I didn't know about this till too late, but I've written letters to all my magistrates throughout my colony, and I promise you won't happen again. So they didn't hang Quakers anymore, but they put a lot of them in jail. I'll have more to say about the Quakers when it comes to Pennsylvania colony. In the meantime, William Penn started a Quaker colony in Pennsylvania, but that's for another paragraph. Before we get to that, though, with the Salem witchcraft trials. Being the father of 2 young girls myself, I can sympathize with the girls. The young girls in Salem were not allowed to play with dolls because this was believed to be a form of idolatry, and any kind of image could be inhabited by a demonic spirit. Forgive folk. This is not me teaching this. This is them, okay? Yes, my daughters did play with dolls, and I still have a lot of them around the house. I have some trophies I won in my days of coaching youth league and church league, softball and basketball. But anyway, they believed that any kind of image at all was a form of idolatry. These girls were not allowed to wear brightly colored clothes, were not allowed to make puppets out of socks or whatever, they were not allowed to sit around and listen to stories, even though they did this anyway. There was a slave girl in a colony named Tituba. Tituba would often visit the Indians and come back and gather these young girls around her and tell stories that she learned from the Indians, greatly against the rules. But these young girls had all kinds of pent-up mental and emotional energy, and one day they just all of them acted like that they were just under the spell of a witch. And they were asked, who's casting this spell? And they first point their finger at one person, then another. Before it was over with, some 21 persons were executed, most of them by hanging, but one of them by having a heavy bunch of stones placed on his chest, and more stones were added until he suffocated. Painful way to go, I must say. Eventually, the Salem colony became a ghost town, and hardly anyone lives there to this day. It's gotten a bad name. But this greatly undermined Puritanism. Eventually, the 5 girls wrote a letter of confession, a letter of apology. All 5 of them lived for several more years and died unmarried and in poverty. All right. Again, there's been several books written about the Salem witchcraft trials. It did a lot to make hunting witches a disgrace. The Dutch settled in what is today New York. Henry Hudson, from whom Hudson Bay is named, the Hudson River. Henry Hudson was looking for a way to get to the Pacific Ocean from the Atlantic. So he went up the Hudson River, and eventually the Hudson River became a shallow little creek. Well, that didn't work. He went, this area right here bears his name. He went here, and it's named after the Hudson River, Hudson Bay named after him. He was looking for a way, and when he got to the Hudson Bay is very, very large. He thought he'd found it, but he went across it and bumped into more land. To make a long story short, they could not find a Northwest Passage, owing to the fact that there was a sheet of ice up in here. This was during what's called the Little Ice Age, and you could not get around the ice. Now, after generations, just in the last 10 or 15 years, we now can get ships, thanks to a heat up of the northern part of the climate. We now can get ships around North America and down into the Pacific. But anyway, Henry Hudson settled in New York. Peter Minuit purchased land from the Indians, and he was a Dutchman. Founded New Amsterdam, which became New York. He called it New Amsterdam. Peter Stuyvesant was a governor. Peter Stuyvesant had had a leg amputated as a result of an injury he'd received in the war. At one time we didn't know which leg it was because we had two portraits of it. One portrait showed his right leg was a peg leg. The other portrait showed his left leg was a peg leg. But I think they have since decided that they know which leg it was. I don't remember which one they decided on. But anyway, he had a peg leg. He was somewhat tyrannical. He was once quoted as saying, "I thank God there are no schools in New York, in Amsterdam, and I hope that there will not be for 100 years." Hoping to keep the people in ignorance. They did have a legislature, but he would often send them home. Finally, the Duke of York, who was the king's brother, he became the next king, the brother of King Charles II, went to New Amsterdam and took it from the Dutch. The people in New Amsterdam would not fight. They said we'd have more rights under the English than we have under Stuyvesant. They refused to fight. So the Duke of York took the colony and named it New York. All right, William Penn. William Penn's father was an admiral in the British Navy, and he helped take Jamaica from the Spanish. Again, if you ever study the history of Jamaica, Jamaica is a small country right here on the other side of Cuba. One day, William Penn and his Navy moved in. The Spanish pretended to negotiate, but on the other side of the island, they were emptying it. They gave up the island without a fight. William Penn was extremely wealthy. He loaned the king a lot of money. I mean, William Penn's father, Admiral Penn, was extremely wealthy. Then the admiral learned that his son had happened the worst thing that could happen to him. He'd become a Quaker. He initially kicked his son out of the house and said, "I'm going to disinherit and disown you." But then he couldn't live without his son. He couldn't think of anything but day and night with his son. So finally went out on the streets looking for him, found his young son and brought him home with full rights of inheritance, Quaker religion and all. The admiral died, and the young William inherited the whole fortune. But this time the mother was deceased also. So William Penn inherited his father's fortune. William Penn, being very wealthy, had a lot of chances to talk to the king. At one point, he was talking to the king, and the king all of a sudden took his crown off. William Penn said, he was supposed to address the king as your majesty, but instead he addressed his friend. "Friend, why dost thou remove thy crown?" And the king said to him, "It's customary that only one man have his head covered when in the presence of the king. I'm supposed to be the only man with a head covered. Since you insist on keeping your hat on, I'm going to take my crown off." The two men understood each other. The king didn't try to convert William Penn, and William Penn did not try to convert the king. But anyway, it became obvious to William Penn and the king both, the king simply could not pay the debt. It was owed. So the king finally said to William, "You take the land on the other side of the Delaware River that is not New Jersey and name it after your father, Penn's Woods, or Pennsylvania." So the king gave William Penn what is today part of the state of Pennsylvania, only the western part. Anyway, the king gave Penn the colony, and William Penn set it up as a Quaker colony. The colony was tolerant. The laws favored the Quaker religion, but that didn't bother most people. William Penn became known as a wise and just ruler. He made peace with the Indians. He insisted no Indian land be taken unless the Indians were compensated. And for many, many years there was peace between the Pennsylvania colony and the Delaware Indians. Now this did not last. If you go to Pennsylvania today, you'll find a lot of persons who will tell you they're part Indian, but full-blooded Indians were driven out long ago due to some events that happened long after William Penn died. Anyway, Pennsylvania was the only colony this time with a one-house legislature. All right. Now, folk, next time we'll take up with what is to lead to the Revolutionary War. England passed a bunch of laws that said that the only ships, English ships, could be used for trade, but these, anyway, we'll talk more about this next chapter. Everybody have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday. Bye-bye.